Hi, my name is Sian Hobill, and I'm going to be talking about cross-cultural communication and how we might be able to think of that skill and practice it in the workplace. In order to give this presentation, I was reflecting upon some of my earliest experiences of communicating. I come from quite an eccentric family, and my grandfather built a medieval castle in Victoria in the late 70s. And so my grandparents owned and operated that attraction right up until a few years ago when my grandmother had to sell that. And as a child, my family spent a lot of time there. We even lived there for a period. My father helped to build some of that castle, and my parents also owned and operated a business within that tourist attraction. So it was quite an interesting experience. In the early to mid to late 80s, the castle also operated as kind of a small zoo, I guess. There was a zoo that was closing down in Melbourne, and my grandparents thought it would be a great idea to turn parts of the castle into enclosures for those zoo animals. So with that, the castle inherited some big cats and a lot of monkeys, some other unusual creatures like peacocks and wild birds. And we also had a little pet monkey called Peppy. So one of my very earliest memories of communicating is with Peppy, the monkey. And Peppy was this gorgeous, tiny little monkey, if you think small, fine, delicate breed of monkey, like a chihuahua. And Pepe would sit on your shoulder, and then he'd sort of run up and over your head. Then he'd grab your ear, and then he'd talk into your ear. Then he'd run back over your head and talk into the other ear. And then he'd just run onto your lap, and then he'd sort of lie and play dead, but he really wanted his belly patted. And he had all these cute and funny little quirky games that he'd play. And he was quite an entertaining character, and he had been trained, I think, at some point. So he was almost like a circus monkey. But he used to sit on the coffee table. You'd be sitting on the couch, and he'd sit on the coffee table. He'd cross his little arms, and he'd just look. And it was like a little staring game that he'd play. And you could feel his mischievous little spirit just waiting for you to flinch, or for your eyes to flicker, or for you to move. And you'd be playing statues with each other. And what would happen in that very deep moment is that the entire room around me would dissolve. I'd become completely absorbed in this communication with Pepe. That moment where we were just eye to eye. And then all of a sudden, he'd stick his hands on his head, and he'd get his little leg up and stick it on his other leg. And then he'd break into laughter, and he'd turn around and he'd point. And behind him would be my grandfather sitting there with his arms on his head and his leg on his knee. And Pepe knew that. And he just thought it was hilarious that I hadn't noticed that. And the funny thing is, I hadn't noticed that because I was so absorbed in Pepe's little game and feeling his cheeky little spirit that I didn't notice anything else that was going on in the room. The other thing that Pepe and I would do is we would be part of an act of one of the shows. So once or twice a day, they'd put on a show on the main arena where there'd be lions jumping through hoops of fire and jugglers, and depending on who was at the castle, the performers, and what season it was, it would be a series of acts. And My grandfather was a magician, so maybe some magic, there'd be some juggling, there'd be some medieval dances, that sort of thing. But what would happen is somebody would ring a bell through the entire castle to round up the crowds and bring them down to the arena. And everybody would sit on some stairs and look down onto this arena. And Pepe was so excited about that. As soon as he heard the bell, he'd sort of run up and jump on my shoulder. And I'd be wearing my costume and we'd be all ready to go. So we'd sort of walk out and I'd be the cute little girl with the cute little monkey, and we'd go and stand at the fence. And the whole idea is that all the kids could come up and admire Pepe. But Pepe was hilarious. Pepe would really play the game. You know, he'd be so animated and he'd hold out his hand to shake hands or sort of carry on and laugh and pretend to interact, but really over the top. And I used to think, Pepe, you are such a fake. You're just a fake. But he was so good at it, you know. But that was the little show Pepe that would come out to play. And so that was one of my really earliest experiences of deep communication. And it wasn't with a human, it was with the monkey. So the castle also had other animals. There was big cats, and there was another big cage that had 2 cages in it, and it housed quite a few monkeys in each cage. And the idea at that time was that you'd pull down a chute and you could put in some food for the monkeys. And so people would love to do that, you know, feed the monkeys. And this was back in the day before kind of animal rights and animal liberation was big. And, you know, in hindsight, it was probably quite awful in terms of that. But at that time, it was what it was. And there was a whole bunch of monkeys living together. It wasn't nice like zoos nowadays where, you know, monkeys are in open enclosures, which is really lovely. These monkeys were all housed together. And you'd put the food in the chute. And so the monkeys would all like jump in and grab all the food, and then they'd go back to their perches and they'd just be eating away, eating their fruit. And you'd think, oh, you know, they're so cute, even though these ones weren't cute. These were more like ugly monkeys, you know, big ones. And that you'd think everything was okay. And then all of a sudden, one of the monkeys would throw a piece of fruit at another monkey. And then that monkey would turn around and, you know, get quite angry about that and then throw some fruit at another monkey. And then all of a sudden, within a minute, the whole cage would be in this cacophony of fighting and you know, anger and frustration, and these monkeys would be screaming at each other, and one would be jumping on another, and they'd be just, you know, furious at each other. But it didn't stop there. What would happen is it's almost as if they could sense that you were still there watching them, and with no clue, with no sign that they were going to do this, a whole bunch of them would turn around and jump off their perch and leap across the air onto the mesh and do this awful face like and so you'd be standing there and there'd be all these monkeys going at you, and it was terrifying. So as a child, you know, that more than once or twice, you could almost know that it was coming, but every time I'd just scream and run because it'd just be this reaction to this horrible event of these monkeys in your face. And the funny thing was, because of that, I used to sit back there and I'd be sitting, and it was quite close to the playground, and I'd be sitting in the playground and I'd watch the tourists feed the monkeys, and then the monkeys doing that to the other tourists and the other kids and even the parents, like getting a shock and screaming. And, you know, I was quite entertained by that, even though that's probably a really horrible thing. And so that was another quite an extraordinary experience of communicating again with monkeys. The next animal, I guess, that I really remember communicating with is the lions, because we inherited a lion family and the lion family had cubs. So, you know, we were in the newspaper and here I am cuddling the little cub, and these cubs grew up into bigger lions, and that was a real treat for me, was to watch these lions grow. So the castle is sort of split into 3 levels: a lower level, a middle level, and then a higher level. And at the higher level, there was a whole big sort of set of cages at the back. Again, probably not big enough for big cats, which should be roaming around in the wild. But again, it was what it was. And so I'd be walking up the hill to go and visit these cats. And usually I was alone or I was with my brother, but, you know, we often did things alone because my parents were running a business within this place. So they were pretty busy and we sort of had free range of the place, which was great. And so I'd be walking up the hill and I'd go and have a look and stand on the fence for ages just watching these lions and the cubs playing with the cubs and sort of the little sibling rivalry that was happening. And they were quite lovely. They had a really nice, warm sort of energy about them, and it was very playful. Next to the lions were some leopards, and again, they were fine. They weren't sort of threatening or scary. They just usually they were just lying around. Actually, during the daytime, they'd just sleep. But next to the leopards was a cage that had a black jaguar, and the thing was, anytime I was walking up that hill, it's like the black jaguar, I could see it watching. It was just standing there watching and watching. And so I had this little bit of anxiety and fear always walking up that hill about that black jaguar just watching. And then I get to the cage and it's like he'd just been standing there watching that whole time, just waiting and waiting and waiting quietly for me to get to that cage. And I'd stand there and this black jaguar would just go so quietly. It would just go to one end of the cage the whole time with these piercing green and amber eyes. And then it would turn around. The eyes would never leave you, and it would just go so quietly to the other side. And then it would turn around again. And this could just go on and on and on. And it was honestly terrifying. It evoked this great sense of fear and anxiety in me, having this animal just staring me down with its piercing eyes. And to this day, I can feel that fear and anxiety still, and I can see those eyes. And that castle was a big place. And it would not matter where I was in that castle. I had this subconscious sort of underlying anxiety and fear, thinking if that black jaguar ever gets out of its cage, I'm dead. I'm gone. I wouldn't even see it. You would not hear the black jaguar. It was so quiet. So I just wanted to outline those quite eccentric stories, I guess, about my childhood and my experience of communicating at a very young age. And because I was reflecting upon communication in general, and I was thinking, from those experiences in particular, there were three things that really came out of those. Firstly, we don't quite understand and appreciate the multiple levels of information that we receive from communicating with another being. Secondly, when we're in communication with another being, we get information about ourselves, and we also get information about the other. And I guess the overall thing is that as humans, we have an uncanny ability to communicate with all beings, which we often forget about. And if we think about that, we can communicate with all beings. Then if we're really looking at the human species and communicating with each other, then that in itself is also quite a wide area for exploration, or an area for reflection and interpretation. So today I'm specifically talking about cross-cultural communication. I don't quite like the term. I know it's politically correct at the moment, but cross-cultural almost to me talks of a duality, when really we want to get to a unity in our communications. So I guess we've pointed out that duality in order to cross cultures and find a unity in diversity. But let's just break it down a bit. So what is culture? You know, there's thousands of sociologists that have talked about it. There's historians that have talked about it. Psychologists have talked about it. You know, it's a whole area of study in itself. But when we communicate, if you think of the world as a map, and then you think of cultures as in a culture being perhaps a defined set of values, beliefs, ideas, I guess physical attributes, internal attributes, the ways in which we relate to our environment, those sorts of things, you might start to think of spheres forming, so circles on the map. Well, it depends on how you're defining those different factors. There's no one set of factor that says this is a culture. There's many sets of factors that could define a sphere. So what you'd find is the map of the world, let's say the world is flat. All of these spheres coming down onto this map. But what you'd find is that they're all overlapping. So if they were all different colors, for example, then all of a sudden the whole world is just going to be layered and layered and layered and layered and layered and layered with multiple colors. So put the world back into a sphere and just think of it, a sphere that is just layered with multiple spheres overlapping with multiple colors. There we go. We're in a happy utopian rainbow world. But what is culture? We don't just jump from one sphere to another and go, hey, I did cross-cultural communication and I did it so well. Wasn't that great? No, we don't do that. So culture is really about relating and our relation with others, the environment, the world. So it's really the spheres of relation that we find ourselves in. And they could be everywhere. So they could be at home, they could be getting in the car, they could be being on a plane, and all of a sudden we're relating to so many different spheres We find ourselves in so many different spheres all the time. When we're talking about the workplace in particular, often workplaces like to define themselves by a set of cultural practices or values. So we'll take our spheres and our sort of multitude of colours and overlapping spheres of how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to everything else, and we'll take them into the workplace. But then so does everybody else. So what we find is we've got all of these spheres and bubbles all coming together in one sort of idea or perceived set of values or ideas. And what we are finding now, and what all of the literature is saying, and what is politically correct, is that we should value diversity, and we should value diversity in those spheres, and in particular in our workplaces. Why? There's so many reasons why. And by now, we're usually pretty up to it. We've read reports, we've read statistics. I mean, in Australia at the moment, we've had a huge, big inquiry into our finance sector where they found that there was a number of decisions made at executive and board levels that didn't actually take into account diversity in thinking. So there's another science as well which talks about cognitive bias theories that actually, as humans, we're intelligent, but our intelligence can be limited by cognitive biases, in that sometimes we'll just make decisions based on familiarity, for example, or we'll have a blind spot in our thinking. So we'll just make a decision not even thinking that it's an intelligent and quite a transparent or an aware decision, when it's actually just made out of our blind spot, for example. So what we're finding now is that in the marketplace, or in the workplace, or perhaps you call it the commercial world, in our workspaces, there's this real idea that diversity in thinking is actually a good thing. And then there's a whole lot of theories that talk about how diversity in thinking can actually be a productive thing, in that it increases work efficiency and work engagement, but then it can also be a profitable thing, in that it can also increase value in terms of a monetary sort of figure in companies or corporations or in workspaces. So there's a lot of literature around diversity and why it's important, and really valuing diversity in cultures. So when we're looking at cross-cultural communication, it's taking into account quite a few ideas, and it's taking into account quite a lot of the literature about diversity. But then we want to say that it's also taking into account ideas about what are acceptable ways to relate to each other. How do we relate? And what is the standard nowadays, especially in the workplace? And now in Australia, we're not that great on human rights, but there is a set standard of rights that are expected in workplaces. So it's not okay to discriminate against a whole range of people based on attributes. It's just not okay. We know that. You can't just treat somebody appallingly because they come from a different culture. So we've got base level rights, we've got ideas about how to relate, and we've got this sort of general global idea that diversity is really important. So how do we look at the skill of communicating cross-culturally, even though I don't like that term? I'm going to call it the skill of effective communication. And I'm going to break that down into 3 parts. And this skill, I really think, is a skill that requires practice. Like any skill, it needs a practice. And the practice you could call, when you're looking at communication, is actually one of contemplation. Contemplation, and you could call it contemplation in action, because we do it every time we communicate with anybody. And if we put this into practice, then what we will see is that our skill in this area will become more fine-tuned, will become more aware, and we will achieve that state of effective communication. And in this skill, I've really reflected on 3 things which I think are really important. And I'm going to try and give you some practical examples to take with you, so that you can also put this practice into action. So the first is communication with respect. The second, transparent communication. And the third thing is authenticity. So authenticity in ourselves, but then authenticity also in our communication. So let's look at communication with respect. When I was a lawyer and I was working in the area of medical law, I was called up by a social worker from a hospital who decided that she needed to blow the whistle about some of her colleagues because she was horrified by a situation that had happened in the hospital that she didn't feel was right, and somebody had suffered greatly because of this. So I received a call, and she actually had to resign from her position because she could not stay in her job any longer, as she felt like she could not work with those people which she had been associating with in that role. The story was that she was working with a family. This was back in the time when the Iraq war had reached its peak. And there was a family that had sought and had been approved political refugee status here in Australia. And when they came to Australia, the mother was heavily pregnant. She ended up in this hospital giving birth, but she hadn't had any antenatal care. She literally just turned up at the hospital and had to birth her baby. The staff, according to this social worker, treated her in a way which she felt was incredibly racist. And as a result of this and some very poor communication, the baby was born, but with very significant disabilities. So I'd received this telephone call from the social worker, and she asked me if I would attend at their house, because at this stage, the mother was sort of terrified of leaving the house. She was in a foreign country. She hadn't acclimatized to the culture. She'd had this awful experience, and also she did not speak a word of English. And the social worker said, look, we could get a translator and we could hire rooms and do an initial client interview, but I don't think she'd come. And I think this is a situation that really has to be addressed. So I turned up at the house and I said, okay, I will come and let's see if we can have a discussion. And I said, but I'm going to need a translator because I will need to ask some really important questions. And as a lawyer, we need to obtain critical and vital information, not only about the medical procedures, but also about a person's personal history. And the social worker said, it's okay. Her eldest teenage daughter will be there and she speaks fluent English and she will be able to translate. So I thought, okay, that should be fine. So I turned up at the house and the mother was there and the husband was there and her 3 daughters were there, including the baby, which did have a significant disability. And they asked me if I would come in and sit down and if I'd like some tea or water. So I agreed. And then I commenced with the interview. And I started to go through my usual list of questions in my mind, thinking the elements of negligence. This is what we need. This is the information I'm going to need. And I like to work through methodically. And then at the end, I like to have a discussion. But what I was finding was that there was a tension, which was probably trauma. This mother and this family had suffered great trauma to which I probably would never understand. And I thought, this isn't going according to how I feel like it should be going. I feel like this has gotten off to the worst possible start. I'm really uncomfortable. They're really uncomfortable with me. What am I going to do? And I thought, you know what? I just need to keep going because this is really important. We need to get the information. I need to find out what's happened and what the options are that might be available. And as a lawyer, we're often faced with complex decisions that have to be made that aren't straight law decisions. There's actually a lot that a lawyer can do in terms of referral to other services, obtaining legal aid funding, those sorts of things. So I also had those quite sort of altruistic values in the back of my mind operating. You know, even if there's not a legal case that comes out of this family needs some support, you know. And so I kept progressing through the list. And one of those questions was, can you tell me how many pregnancies you've had? And the mother, which was translated by the daughter, said, I've had 7 pregnancies. And then I said, okay, can you tell me how many children you have? And the mother said, I have 5 children. And I just looked at her and I looked at her daughter. And that's a very difficult question to ask, the next one, which is, can you please tell me what happened to the other children? And of course, there was a very sad story around that. And I could see that the mother was starting to actually open to me and telling her story. And then I asked, okay, can you please tell me the names and the dates of birth of your children. So we went through those details. And then I could see that her 3 daughters were there, but she also had 2 sons. So I asked her, are your 2 sons here in the house? And in that moment, she looked at me and her daughter looked at me. And her daughter said, they're still in Iraq. And up until this point, I had thought that in order to be a professional, it was actually really unprofessional to cry. But what happened was, in that moment, I could feel tears just streaming down my face. And they just came and they came and they came. And what that did was it opened something in that space between myself and the mother and her eldest daughter. It's like the room closed in and we sat as 3 women, and then I watched as tears streamed down their faces. And I knew enough about the Iraqi war that during that time, young boys in particular were being taken, and awful things were happening to those young boys. So I knew enough about the war at that time to know that as a parent and as a family, that would be one of the most horrific experiences that you could ever endure, knowing that your child was somewhere completely out of your realm, and that you'd probably never get your child back, and that horrific things were happening to those children. The sort of torment and torture that would create is horrific. But not only that, this woman and this family had endured and suffered so much trauma, including a completely, in my view, unnecessary situation where her baby was born with significant disabilities. And that is probably the most poignant communication I've ever had that highlighted this idea of respect. Because you see, respect is not just I tick a box and we do window dressing. You have rights and we don't discriminate and let's all have equal opportunity. It's not that. Respect is this, I think. I hear you, I perceive you, and I feel you. That is respect. We all know what it's like to have those deep moments with another where we actually hear, perceive, and feel each other. Now that is respect. And that is something that we should aim for in every communication that we have. So communication, contemplation, and action. Part of that is respect. I hear you, I perceive you, and I feel you. The next part, I think, of this practice of communication, effective communication, is transparency. So another story. in my first job, when I was working in employment and anti-discrimination and equal opportunity, I had a boss who briefed a barrister who had had a significant accident in his 20s and was a paraplegic and was in a wheelchair, but an incredibly intelligent barrister who was extremely effective at his job and an extraordinarily great person to have on board on the legal team. And I wasn't very experienced in anything in terms of law at all. I was quite fresh. I was still studying at uni and working at the same time. And my boss said, okay, Sian, it's time that you have a file and you brief a barrister, and you're going to accompany the barrister to the various tribunals and court hearings, and you're going to put the briefs together and you're going to do this and that and this and that and the other. And I thought, great, I'm ready for this. I'm in and I'm on. And so what happened was I was so proud. I put my brief together, which was 3 heavy ring binders. And I walked up to the barrister's chambers and, I was having a meeting with the barrister to discuss the brief and discuss the case and give him initial instructions. And the thing was, I had never in my life spent time with somebody that had a significant disability such as paraplegia and was in a wheelchair. So I was completely out of my depths in that regard. I had no idea. But I had all of these altruistic values about being open and kind and compassionate and considerate and all of those things. And, I ticked all the boxes, and I considered myself a humanitarian and a compassionate fellow human being, all of those things. So I briefed this barrister, and things were good to start with. And then as time went on and we spent more and more and more time together, I thought, you know what? I've got to be the nicest person I can probably be. And I started opening doors, and I was pouring water all the time, and I was fetching the brief, and I was bringing lunch over if we had lunch together, and I was really nicety nice. But what happened was something wasn't right. Our communication dynamic just was not right. So I was getting nicer and nicer and nicer, and he was actually getting meaner and meaner and meaner and grumpier, to the point where I went home one day and I thought, I don't know what's wrong. I feel like I'm trying to do everything to be nice. I'm so nice. And I thought, he just hates me. This man hates me. And that was really confronting. And we ended up at court. And at this point, I actually developed a bit of an anxiety and fear sort of disorder inside, I guess, because I just didn't know how to communicate anymore. I was trying to be as nice as I possibly could, and sweet and caring and considerate. And we got to court, and I was a little bit crippled by anxiety. And I had to be this intelligent, switched on junior lawyer that was briefing the barrister, and we had to meet the client, and it was really important that we looked like we had it all together. But I just didn't feel like I had anything together. I didn't feel like our dynamic was working at all. And he needed to stop by the toilet. And he said, okay, Sian, go upstairs and I'll meet you up there, in his gruff and sort of angry voice. And I just completely shut down and thought, I can't go upstairs, not by myself. And I said, no, it's okay. I'll wait for you. And he just looked at me, and it was like the icing on the cake for him. And he didn't say anything, but the sort of passive aggressive tension that oozed from that quite a short interlude was just awful. And I sat there waiting while he went to the toilet. And then he came out, and then we went up, and somehow we managed to get through this awful experience together. And he did brilliantly, which was great. And I played nice. But, inside I knew that something was fundamentally wrong. So I went back to the office after this, what I thought was a really horrible day. And I had to type up my file note. And then I found myself putting some notes in my file note. I cannot communicate with this barrister anymore. I think he hates me. I'm finding it very difficult to voice my opinion. I'm trying to be so nice. I've done everything to be so nice. And then I thought, I can't work on this case anymore. I'm completely shutting down. And I booked an appointment with my boss. So I went into her office and I sat down, and she was also my mentor at the time. And she said, "What's going on, Sian?" So I got my file note out and I said, "Okay, well, today this is what happened, and legally the case went well, and rah-de-rah-de-rah." And then I said, "I'm not sure if it's okay to discuss this, but I just think that this barrister hates me." And I explained the situation, and that I'd been really nice, and that I'd been trying to open doors and pour glasses of water, and I even waited while he went to the loo, and I thought that was a nice thing to do. And she just started cracking up, just started laughing. She said, "Sian, imagine if you were in a wheelchair and you had all of these people that were running around having to do things for you all of the time. Just imagine that for 1 second, let alone all of the other things that go along with being in a wheelchair, including physical ailments, pain, suffering, the fact that your internal organs are all compacted together, that your muscles are probably twitching, you've got nerve damage, all of those things. Forget about those for a minute and just think about the fact that you can't do all of those things that you were used to doing and that you love doing. You no longer have your independence. Do you think that you would want somebody taking away the little things that you can do for yourself and by yourself?" And I just thought, oh my goodness, haven't I gone about things the completely wrong way? And that was a complete lack of understanding on my behalf. And of course, effective communication is a practice. You don't just wake up enlightened in life, do you? It's a skill. You have to work towards this skill. So of course you're going to muck it up. There's going to be endless examples of where you're going to fail miserably. And that's fine. But the thing that came out of that series of communications is this idea about transparency. You see, like I was saying before about communicating with the animals, what is it in our communications that we often forget about? We forget that there are entire levels of information that come out of our communications. The environment, from within ourselves, and within the other. Now, we've got the environment, somebody that has a major disability and is in a wheelchair. Go and do some research. Do some research about that environment. Spend some time with people that are in that environment. And then try and imagine yourself in that environment. Okay? That's where I failed, number one. Number two, what was the information inside of myself? From the day I walked in that room, I was more concerned about succeeding in my role as the junior lawyer because this was my big break, right? So I just wanted to do everything right. And everything right in my mind was nicety nice, nice, which was all wrong, wasn't it? But the thing was, I walked in that door and inside of me, I felt a discomfort. Why did I feel uncomfortable? Because I'd never been in this situation before. And then instead of going, oh, Sean, you've never been in this situation before, you feel uncomfortable and you feel a discomfort. What is that? Let's explore that. No, I pushed that down and put nicety, 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 nice on top of that. And then the third thing that we usually forget in our communication is that there's so much information that is coming from the other. So the point right at the end where I was waiting, we had that communication about him going to the toilet and him just looking at me and having that sort of passive aggressive reaction, that is a definite cue from somebody. You are not respecting me. I really dislike you. And with that, we need to go back to that respect. I hear you, I perceive you, and I feel you. You see, leading up to that point, he had been giving me so many cues that I was not respecting him. And I was completely oblivious to those because I was still sitting in my own discomfort and pushing that down with the nicety, 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 nice. So when we talk about transparency, we need to have a look at this practice of being transparent. And we need to contemplate when we're communicating. What's arising in myself? What's arising in the other? What is the environment? Am I familiar with it or not? If I'm not familiar with it, can I get familiar with it or not? If not, how can I be transparent about that? We're not expected to be perfect. We just need to be transparent so that people know, oh, it's okay. She's not perfect. At least she's admitted it. And let's work from there. So that's communication with respect and communication with transparency. Now, the third thing I think when we're looking at this effective communication as contemplation in action, is authenticity. So I tried to work in a commercial law firm because I'd had quite a few years working in employment anti-discrimination and equal opportunity, and that was really intense work and I loved it, but I felt like perhaps I should try something different. I'm still a relatively sort of junior lawyer that's starting out, and I would like to widen my experience. And I ended up at one of the top tier law firms working in their commercial department, which was great. Is an interesting and another experience. But what happened after a little while was that I realized I kept getting invited to the Friday lunches. And I also realized that at the Friday lunches, there seemed to be a certain type of male, and that there seemed to be a certain type of client sort of relation that was going on, and it was usually the partners trying to get a very prominent client on board, and there was lots of money involved in this. And it took me a little while to cotton on to the fact that I was young and, blonde, and I think I was being taken to these lunches just because, I was eye candy, I think. Um, and it made me very uncomfortable. And I got to the point where I thought, hang on a tick. You know, we talk about respect. I hear you, I perceive you, and I feel you. Well, I felt like there really wasn't quite enough respect for me in that environment. And it was really difficult, but I decided, and it didn't take long, so it was only a few months, but I decided that I needed to be in a place where I was authentic. And I needed to be somewhere where I could be authentic in my communications. Because I had little Peppy Monkey, example, uh, who'd sit on my shoulder and, you know, he was fake, basically. And I used to think, you know, you little fake. And I was sitting at these lunches and I'd sort of been doing the same, you know, hi, how you going? And I just thought, you're fake. You're being really fake. So that was a really difficult situation. But I think the thing is, people realize when you aren't authentic in your communications. We've all experienced a transactional communication where you just feel like you're a number, or you're a statistic, or you're a checkbox. And as a professional in the professional world, it's not a nice feeling to be that number or that statistic or that checkbox. And I guess for me, I reached a point where I thought, I don't like that myself, and therefore I don't want to impart that either. And that, even though I left that role, I still worked in the legal industry, and there were many times where I could apply that to situations. And there were a few where I was matched with clients, or I had received an initial client interview and I met with the client. And there was just something about the dynamic where I thought, you know what, this client isn't going to respect me. It doesn't matter what I say or how much sort of wisdom or knowledge or intelligence I have, or how much I know the law, or whether I'm a specialist or any of that stuff. There is some barrier there. And I could perceive that and I could feel that. So with that, I took my authenticity and I booked a meeting with my superior at the time. So this happened quite a few times. And I would talk about that, which is quite a difficult thing to talk about, because as lawyers, we usually have a bit of an ego. You know, we want to succeed all of the time, and we want to look like we're, meeting our targets, and we've got all these new clients coming on board, and we're really great at what we do, right? So you kind of have to shove that down, and then you have to front up to somebody that's superior, and then also talk about the fact that your client interview didn't go so well. But in those discussions, my boss or my superiors were brilliant. And they would go something like this. I'd say, look, I've had this initial client interview. I think there's a great case, or I've managed to get this information, or I couldn't get this information, but I don't think the client is going to respect me as their lawyer. And, at the time I was pretty young. So young, female, blonde. There's a bit of a perception that you want a lawyer that's senior. There's something about seniority, looking a bit older, more mature, having that knowledge and that intellect, and that worldly experience. Lots of clients want somebody that's got worldly experience. So it's all completely understandable. And the my boss or my superiors would always say, that's okay. That's okay. We don't want to lose this client. Let's figure out another way. And then we'd talk about ways in which we could manage this situation. So you could perhaps have one of the senior lawyers that did all the face-to-face interviews and develop that personal relationship with the client. And I could still keep the file and do all of the day-to-day work on the file, deal with the other solicitors on the other side, that sort of thing. So there were ways around that. But in those moments, it was really important to be authentic. So having that knowledge that you would never bring your whole self to that communication because there were walls up which were not allowing you to be your authentic self. So I think when we're looking at this communication as contemplation in action, there's those three elements. There's that respect, transparency, and authenticity. And the thing is, when we're in this sphere of communication and we do it all the time, whoever we're communicating all of the time, we should be really mindful and conscious about the dynamic, the three things. There's a whole field of information that's going on around that communication. So, if you think back to the jaguar staring at me, that communication was a huge sphere in that it actually physically took over the entire castle. So anywhere where I was roaming in that castle, I was aware that there was an ongoing communication. And it wasn't a nice ongoing communication. So when we're in a relation with a client or with somebody that we're going to have an ongoing relationship with, we've got to be really mindful about that. What are they taking away from the conversation? How far is that affecting their sphere? And is that, a nice sort of even and flowing sphere? Or is it something that's got a bit of a disjunct or a discomfort? Like the communication that I was having with the barrister. It wasn't a nice sphere with, a nice flow like a wave. It was a uncomfortable sphere with lots of disjuncts that were occurring. So we've got to be mindful about that. Every communication we have, we should be aiming for a beginning and an end. And during the middle, we have this nice wave that flows through that has respect. So I hear you and I perceive you. And in that moment, if we can aim to really feel the other or the group of others that we're communicating with, then what we'll find is that moment, where I'm with the women from Iraq, or where I'm with Peppy the monkey, completely sort of absorbed in that communication where we actually share a piece of each other. We take that with us. And I think that is really effective communication. And that idea is probably at the heart of this thing that we're calling cross-cultural communication. And I just wanted to think of a metaphor or something that you could take away with you that's quite simple. So a visual representation of this. And the yin and the yang symbol is probably the best one that I could think of. And I did a bit of a drawing here. So the yin and the yang, unity in diversity. And I've got having communication that's transparent, having communication that's authentic. And then here's that thing about the sphere. You know, we want a beginning and an end. We want it to just flow nicely. And then we want the body of our communication just to flow like a wave. You know, we don't want disjuncts. And then at the end or during that communication, we want to hear, perceive, and to really feel, you know, each other. So we take a little piece of each other with us, or we keep them with us. And that's what causes and creates that unity, that moment of unity. Thank you. That's my presentation about cross-cultural communication.